I have been traveling for the last few days with a new and very dear friend, Carole Hemmelgarn. And Carole and I met probably about a year and a half ago through the Patient Safety Movement Foundation. That's my recall anyway.
Yes.
And we happen to both be planning to be on September 17th, World Patient Safety Day. We both plan on being at Capitol Hill in the United States. And you guys have seen me talk about this before. This is my symbol. This is sort of my North Star of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it is really to travel the country and speak with people of every walk of life and every frame of mind about what they think of when they think about medical safety. Carole and her family have had an unfortunate and very dramatic experience with medical care and unsafe care of medical, and that's why we'll be walking in September. But I know that there are very important matters to you personally, and I would love for you to just speak about those.
So to give a little background to frame this up, my 9-year-old daughter, Alyssa, died of multiple medical errors, and I felt like I couldn't fix everything, but there's passion that you get in certain areas that drive the work that you do. And a couple of areas, one is we never really had an honest conversation about what happened to her. So I'm very passionate about having communication and resolution programs and true honest conversations after medical errors, which really reside when you have a culture of safety, a just culture, and a culture of transparency. So a lot of my work focuses in that area. And then one of the other things that came out in her care is really how we attach labels to people. Mm-hmm. And in this day and age of what is going on in the world with implicit bias, racial bias, all kinds of bias, we sometimes put labels and they can be harmful. They can impact care. They can impact so many things. But interestingly, people may look at the term label different. Mm-hmm. They may define it different. And that's one of the things we have to be really aware of is one, that words have power. Mm-hmm. But words also can be harmful. Simple words. But then they can mean one thing to somebody and they can mean something completely and vastly different to someone else.
You and I had this experience yesterday. In fact, I was describing my experience and some thoughts that I had about how to improve medical safety, and I was using the word label. And what I loved about our conversation is that you were able to speak up and share with me what transpired for you when you heard that word. And we had what I would call a very fruitful, honest, open conversation. We weren't shy about it. You weren't shy about saying, you know what, Vonda, that word really doesn't work well for me, and here's why. And then I tried to say the same thing back to you, but try a couple of different words. And I learned in that process, it helped me understand that a word that I was using, which was label, was limiting for you. And when that happens, then of course we know what happens next is the listening goes away, or the assumptions start to rise, and we're no longer in an engagement at that point. And you and I have both really spent quite a number of years now, due to the experiences that we have had with the medical system and the death of our loved ones, your daughter, my husband, trying to have communications with these individuals who may not have the direct experience that we have, but definitely have the interest in improving medical safety. Would you just speak a little bit about that? You are a professor, you speak about that with students, you teach about that. You've had the grace of going back into the hospital where Alyssa had been diagnosed with cancer and then died because of medical errors. You've been communicating there. What stands out for you, and what would you recommend to a leader in a hospital, or even a nurse or a physician who wants to improve in their communications, but maybe doesn't quite know how to start?
I think the first thing we have to realize is communication issues aren't just in the medical field. They're every field. I mean, one of the biggest breakdowns in marriages, conversations among colleagues is the message that the sender is sending somewhere can get lost till the receiver gets it. So I think first we always have to level set and say it is an issue everywhere. Where it becomes more dangerous is in healthcare because people can be harmed. And so my background is actually in the field of communication. And you realize how things get lost in translation, you know, a term often used, but you also realize that there can be trigger words that create an actual visceral feeling in some people. So for instance, you know, we were talking a little bit about labels. So let me explain that when my daughter went into the hospital, she was diagnosed with leukemia and she died 10 days later. You do not die of leukemia in this day and age in 10 days. And there were multiple mistakes. But when she went in, a resident that saw her attached a label to her. They gave a term and they said she was anxious. And they put this in the medical record. They did not ask me or my husband, is your daughter an anxious child? Because we would say, absolutely not. Not at all. But what we have to realize is here was a young girl that suddenly finds out she has cancer, very aware of cancer because she lost her grandpa to cancer, and her dad is a cancer survivor. So this was a term she was well acquainted with. She could not go in the normal oncology floor because there were no beds, so she had to go into bone marrow transplant, which means booties, gown, cap, mask, because it has to be a very protected, sterile environment. So, was she scared, afraid, frightened? Absolutely. But what we don't do is we don't treat scared, afraid, frightened. We treat anxiety. So my whole thing is we attach labels sometimes, and those labels are carried throughout the care, and they're not right. And in her case, it stuck, and that was part of the reason of her death. And she was never anxious. You know, so one of the things I try to teach is when someone comes into the hospital, for 24 to 48 hours, they really shouldn't be labeled as anxious or anxiety unless there is already a known disorder. Because there's something called state and trait. You know, when you come in, it's occurring now and it may last a short time, whereas others, it's actually a diagnosis. So state or trait. And it's like, if 24 or 48 hours it's still there, fine. But these labels, nobody takes them out of the medical record. Once things go in a medical record, rarely do they get pulled out. So that's why I really struggle when we attach labels to people.
That makes sense.
You know, we don't always know, and they are harmful.
So if I could say back to you, if we're looking at this through the caregiver lens, the professional, whatever their role is, physician, nurse, you know, there are dozens and dozens of professional roles that are in that caregiving role. Your words of wisdom to them and the people that you're training in those fields is wait a period. Identify what the state of the person is. Maybe that I would think of that as more situational.
Exactly.
And that's where I'm frightened because I'm in a hospital, and then the trait is more inherent, like this is their norm. Let's look for a moment at the public. We both know that in large part, the general public is not aware that the errors that they are experiencing, you ask most people if they've ever had a lost record or if they've had a delayed diagnosis or misdiagnosis. Large percentage of people will say yes, they've experienced that. But they are not often experiencing harm associated with that. And so I want to turn toward them for a moment. Okay. Those individuals who are listening to you right now, what would you advise them to do if they find themselves either as a patient in a hospital environment or rehabilitation or some sort of a healthcare environment, or they're a loved one or a family member. What do you say to them to try to keep those labels from affixing either too soon or too permanently, and letting that become a distraction to their actual diagnosis and the care for that?
So I think what's so important now is that patients have access to their medical records, that we can actually look at the records and then we can say, you know what, this isn't right. Because so often when patients do and they are able to see, they'll find there's a lot of mistakes in the medical record. For instance, they've been taken off this med, or that wasn't the right diagnosis, exactly what you're saying. So if we're really going to be a collaborative team in healthcare and have it safe, patients need to be able to look at that too. And it's something that there's open notes now that Segal Bell has started doing. Like, she's been researching, and different institutions are doing it, that patients can look. And I think it makes a more robust conversation and dialogue with your provider. And it also is, your provider can't just put certain things in there. They have to be thoughtful now about what goes in there, because patients are going to see it. But then patients need to be on that side too, receptive to, yeah, you are right. I said I was taking my blood pressure medication, but I'm not. And, so it really does have to be a partnership. So I think that's the first way to avoid some of those labels, because providers aren't going to put those labels in a chart. And if they do, if it's something that a patient or family member disagrees with, they can say, this is inaccurate, it needs to come out.
That aspect of being able to influence medical records, I only just learned within the last few months because of this Zigzag4Z and all of the interviews that I've been doing. It was a chaplain who shared with me that sometimes she will work with the person to enter their statements into their medical records. It had never occurred to me. I had no idea that was an option. And I think that that's true for a lot of people, that they just simply do not know that. Now, I know that things vary from state to state, and certainly from hospital to hospital or medical center to medical center. But it's, as you just pointed out, it's something you can actually ask for, and it can be really helpful.
Right.
There was an experience with DVTs that I learned after Yogi Raj passed away from a pulmonary embolism, and that was that there is a very high incident in medical records of patients, quote unquote, refusing the SCDs, which are the compression devices that goes on the leg. You know that, but for the audience, that's what that is. And in fact, when Johns Hopkins did a little bit more research, and this is leading to a question about patient and family engagement, what they learned was that there wasn't a refusal. It's just that there was limited options for that nurse or that care provider to click. And so it would get defaulted to refusal, when in fact, it was just that they weren't on, or they were out for a walk with their PT, or there were a lot of other things that were going on. Those medical records, I don't think people realize just how valuable they can be because of shift changes and handoffs, and also even, I know you and I had a long conversation about how difficult it was to get the quote-unquote complete records after we realized that there were errors involved in the care for our loved ones. So I'd like to conclude with a question about engagement. You have taken a path of staying engaged even after such a traumatic and terrible outcome for you, your family, for your daughter, for her brother. What is it that you think would compel somebody to, let's just look upstream in the proactive side rather than the reactive side? What do you think we could possibly tell the average person that would help them stay more engaged as they're entering that relationship with those care providers in whatever environment that it is?
I think the first thing is you've got to feel like you have a trusting relationship. So one, that this is someone you can be open and honest with,
Mm-hmm.
because we play a role in this. We have to make sure we're telling them everything to get the best care. I also think we can be smarter about being engaged in our care. So if someone, if your provider says you have high blood pressure and you're not really sure what that is, then we need to ask, tell me more about that. What are my options? If you don't want to be put on meds, you tell them that. I don't really want to go on medication. So what are my other options of things that I can do? And then it sort of sometimes becomes a negotiation. The provider may say, look, I'll give you a month. And if you need to exercise and, lose 10 pounds and you need to remove salt from your diet. So to me, it's all about the dialogue. It's understanding if you're going into the hospital or for a procedure, what are all the potential concerns I should worry about?
Mm-hmm.
So there's something called informed consent that you go through. And informed consent is important, but informed consent is designed by the medical community.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have a patient-centered focus, that it's our language, words we can often understand. And usually what happens is it happens right before we're to go in for a procedure. Instead of something I advocate for is, if I know I'm going in for a procedure, give me the paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
Let me sit in my home where I'm comfortable and I can get on a computer and Google a word if I need to and be more educated. And I can write down those 4 or 5 things I'm concerned about. And then you go in when you're in the right frame of mind and you have the true informed conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that way you can see the potential issues that could come up. So then if they happen to, you're not surprised. And you can also share with your loved one or who may be caring for you, hey, watch out for A, B, and C, because these 3 things might happen after I have this procedure. So, to me, it's always about awareness. So we have to have skin in the game. And maybe if we don't, then we should everyone should always have an advocate there. And, maybe if you're not in the right frame of mind, then you make sure they are, and they know what those things are that could potentially go wrong. So I think that is the biggest way, because we can mitigate some of this if we pick up on signs and symptoms earlier. I think one of the other things just to circle back a little bit, we were talking about the medical record.
Mm-hmm.
The medical record is a beautiful thing, but we don't find the patient in the medical record.
Mm-hmm.
The patient is the person in the bed that you're face to face with.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to always remember, and one of the things I promote, and I've gone round and round with certain health professionals on this, if you are meeting someone for the first time, you should go see them before you read the medical record.
Mm-hmm.
Because this way, there's no preconceived notion, there's no bias, there's no perception. Because what happens is other people have different experiences, and that oftentimes goes in the medical record, and it may be their bias. So for instance, maybe you're there with your child and someone comes in and you like to ask questions, and the nurse perceives that as you are difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So what goes in the medical record? Mom is difficult. Someone else comes in and they love that you're engaged asking questions, because they're like, this is going to be great. We've got a partnership here. Mom is going to work with me. Well, if they go and see mom is difficult, they walk in the room and it's a different experience unless they come in themselves. So I really say the medical record is to augment the face-to-face conversation. It's a great tool, but we always find the patient as the person in the bed in front of us.
That's a very important note for anybody, and including the patients and family members, to really expect that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're getting close to done with the days when we just look to our physician or that nurse and just want to just put our whole lives in their hands.
Mm-hmm.
Of course we want them to do their best, but they really need us engaged also. I'm going to put a pause here for one moment because there's one other question, and I know that most people are not going to have the time to listen to a longer interview. So let's just take a pause, and I'm going to come back for a part 2 because I want to speak with you about harm, long-term impacts of harm, if you're okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we already had one interview, and if you haven't seen that yet, I would invite you to look at the recording with Carole Hemmelgarn just prior to this one. But I also wanted to ask Carole some questions about harm, the long-term impacts of harm, because that's something that you have spent quite a bit of time doing. Carole Hemmelgarn has a very personal experience, and if you wouldn't mind, just give us a very, very brief view of that, and then do speak with us, if you would, about, and especially for care providers who really want to do the right thing but maybe don't have that personal experience. You and I both really think it would be helpful for care providers to really hear the stories around longer road, the longer impact of harm. Would you speak to that, please?
Sure. So oftentimes there's a couple different scenarios when harm happens. If an organization is set up with perhaps a communication resolution program or a system in place, they'll have those conversations with the family in an expedient time, and a lot of times they'll take care of the family. It doesn't mean the family still isn't going to hurt down the road, but they get answers to the questions of why those events happen. So I want to put that scenario there. Then there's the other scenario that oftentimes organizations will shut down, and the patient or family don't find out what has happened to them or a loved one. And one that is unethical, but it is a second harm. It's a second tragedy that they suffer because they're always wondering what happened, and they carry an immense guilt. So right now in the research world, we're starting to look at the intergenerational harm. Most organizations don't track what happens to patients or families after this. Once they get through with, we either said this is it, there's no more, or maybe there was financial compensation or whatever, there just comes a period it's over. But what is happening is they're taking care of their care providers, which they need to after harm, and they can get them the mental health, they can support them, they can be there, and that needs to be done, and they have a way to track that. Nobody's taking care of the patient or family after harm. There's very few organizations have mental health services that they will support them through. We're just starting to uncover, because we're talking more about harm, is that sometimes the repeat harm comes out 8 or 10 years later, when it's our children who suddenly need mental health support because something is finally broken in them. And I have talked to other people that have lost children, and I'm starting to really see this theme emerge as our kids become young adults or college students. And it's very disconcerting. And what I see is that if families had some answers, it's not as egregious. If a family doesn't know what happened, that harm runs deeper. And the sad thing is you can't predict what's coming. So you know certain things that pop up now and you think, is this the last thing? I don't know what's going to happen 4 or 5 years down the road. But I can tell you, we have to start to follow the patients and families. We often hear well, something happened. For instance, there was a nurse at Seattle Children's that gave an overdose of a med, and she got fired, and that wasn't the right way to handle it. They did not take care of her. They sort of should have supported her, and she committed suicide. There's a way to track that for providers. What we don't know is how many patients or families, how many children and patients or families.
Yeah.
So the long-term harm continues, and I don't think the organizations really realize how deep it runs.
Yeah, and how long of a trajectory there is. I really appreciate your point that, if it's a staff member or a partner within that organization, there is a way to sort of track the progress, and they can say, okay, yes, I think, they get to say, yes, I think I'm ready to go back to work now, or I think I can stop this therapeutic intervention now, or no, I need it longer, or all those options. But you're absolutely right. The family, in many cases, they just try to get the family off their radar screen as soon as possible with no answers at all. And even if there are some levels of engagement, you're absolutely right that there's really no formal way to track that. I'm gonna point to one thing that you and I worked on, and then I'll close this interview. And that is to really try to address, not in a formal way, but in an informal way, address the number of people who have experienced some form of medical error that resulted in harm or death, because we're not counting. And we know that it's a very high number. We can look at medical records and we can say it's probably about the third leading cause of death, even in the environment of COVID, by the way. So when we think about COVID, and we're very, very concerned about that, and for good reason, because that could get much higher if we don't intervene. So I'm not trying to say, oh, it's just no big deal. It's a huge deal. And even in that environment, the third leading cause of death being the situation where good people go in to give great care, but are not given the environment to do so properly, and then people harmed as a result, patients, family members, those care providers, permanently sometimes harmed, death in too many cases as well. We're not counting. And so you and I, in a meeting a year and a half ago or so, sort of had one of the things that I love about being with you is that we tend to elevate each other's ideas. And on the Patient Safety Movement website, and actually on a link on this vlog, so I will make sure it gets put in the vlog, we are asking people to just give $1 for every person they know who has been harmed or has died from a medical error. And on the flip side, we also want to honor the people who go into work every day and do prioritize safety and are doing their very, very best to create those environments by speaking up, by making sure that speaking up creates learning, that learning gets transferred to the minimizing of that error in those situations. So I just want to thank you for that partnership again, and encourage people who are listening now to, it's $1 for every life. For me, I had to stop counting at about 126. It just started to be too painful. So I'm not saying you have to limit it to $1. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who will know many more than one, but even if it is just a recognition of one, it will help us just to get a sense of the magnitude of what your family and my family have experienced, and so many other families that we've come to know and really love and work with every day. So I'm going to look forward to seeing you again in September. This time together has been so meaningful for me.
Well, thank you. I have enjoyed it too, and we'll keep pushing forward for the best safe care that we can for everyone, patients, families, and the providers.
Yeah. It's going to take all of us together.
Yes.
We can't, I liked your word, I think you used the word bifurcating. Here, this is not a time to bifurcate of who should be cared for. We all have to work together to provide safe medical care.
Yes.
And that includes the general public who are just learning about it. So if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to email me or give a shout out on social media channels. I very much welcome your input. And also, if you have a desire to be interviewed for whatever reason, as I zigzag from Southern California to Capitol Hill, I hope you'll invite yourself to do so. I would like to interview you. Have a great day. Thank you. And thank you so much, Carole, for
Thank you,
taking
Mona.
this time.
Safe travels.
Thank you.